Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for bearing with us. It's been a very exciting conference in more ways than one. Anyway, so today we're here to celebrate the Geochemical Fellows and also hear the plenary session. In 1996, the Geochemical Society and the European Association of Geochemistry established the honorary title of Geochemistry Fellow to be bestowed upon outstanding scientists who have, over some years, made a major contribution to the field of geochemistry. Together with Bernard Marty, the president of the EAG, I am honored to present the 2018 inductees to this prestigious group. First, we would like to thank the members of the Fellows Award Committee for their remarkable work assessing more than 60 nominations. The pool of nominees was particularly strong, and we are very grateful to the committee for giving us an excellent class of fellows. I know that they did a lot of work. We also thank those who sent a nomination. Taking time to nominate a colleague for an honor like this is an act of real generosity. We invite you to submit nominations for next year's awards by October 31st. We especially encourage nominations reflecting diversity in gender and geography. You can find more information on either society's website. Okay, so Bernard, I believe you come up now, and you will be introducing the fellows, and I will be giving them their certificates.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's my honor to call the new fellows, 2018 Geochemistry Fellows. And the first one I would like to call is Jess Atkins of the California Institute of Technology for pioneering the field of deep-sea coral paleoceanography, as well as for major contribution to our understanding of the control of ocean salinity on glacial interglacial timescale, the control on precipitation and dissolution of biogenic carbonates, and the effect of sulfide weathering on atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. Please, Jess. Now I would like to call Michael A. Arthur of Pennsylvania State University for his work on light elements, stable isotopes, major, minor, and trace elements, paleoceanography, and paleoclimatology. Please, Arthur. Miriam Barr-Matthews of the Geological Survey of Israel for demonstrating that isotopes in speleothems provide a record of temperature and rainfall in the continental realm complementary to the marine and polar records of ancient climate. Congratulations. Daniel Frost, of the University of Beirut for contribution toward understanding the redox state and volatile budget of planetary interiors and in deciphering how this affects planetary evolution and physical properties of different parts of rocky planets. In trying to address this problem, he has made many innovative developments in high-pressure experimental techniques. Congratulations, Dan. Jérôme Gaillardet of the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris for his groundbreaking work in deriving global average element cycles from the chemical and isotope signature in the Earth's largest rivers, for pioneering methods towards using the boron isotope paleo seawater for pH proxy, and for his engagement in establishing a worldwide set of critical zone observatories. Congratulations, Jérôme. Sigurdur Reynir Gislason of the University of Iceland for major contribution to carbon capture and storage system and our understanding of volcanic hazard. Congratulations, Sigi. George R. Eltz of the University of Maryland for his contribution to the geochemistry of metals, metalloid, chlorine, and bromide in natural waters, and the development of analytical methods used in geochemical studies, as well as his high-impact work on molybdenum speciation and uptake in sulfidic sediment. Congratulations, George. Janet J. Heering of EAVAG, the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, ETH Zurich, and EPFL for making pioneering contribution to fundamental aspects of aquatic chemistry, to the public health problem of arsenic contamination of drinking water, and to the interfacing of science and policy for sustainable management of water resource. Congratulations, Janet. Catherine Jandel of Lagos, Toulouse, for a novel boundary exchange hypothesis in which she identified a previously unknown process that may, in fact, serve as a principal source of many dissolved chemical species in the ocean. Once controversial, studies over the past decade have supported her transformative ideas, moving the hypothesis to its own established position in marine geochemistry. Congratulations, Catherine. William S. Rieberg of the University of California, Irvine, for his... Oh, sorry. Oh, I made a mistake.
Craig Manning.
Craig Manning. Please excuse me. But you are the next. Okay, Craig Manning of the University of California, Los Angeles, for being one of the leading scientists to push our quantitative understanding of aqueous fluids to higher pressure and temperature than previously possible, and with that, drive new discovery about what fluids in the lower crust and subduction zone can do. Congratulations, Craig. William S. Rieberg of the University of California, Irvine, for his seminal contribution to the field of biogeochemistry and global elemental cycling. His work has focused on methane cycling in ocean sediment and waters in particular, and he was the first to discover and describe the anaerobic oxidation of methane. Congratulations. Niels Peter Revsberg of Aarhus University for his great contribution to biogeochemistry through the development and application of microsensors for oxygen, sulfide, pH, and other constituents. His accomplishments have been critical for understanding on how microscale microbial and geochemical processes are linked to early diagenesis and element cycling. Congratulations, Niels. Zachary Sharp of the University of New Mexico for his creative, innovative, and broad application of stable isotope techniques across the geophysical and biological science. Okay, I think now... Oh, yeah, all right.
So everybody needs to move in front of the podium.
There are three fellows that could not make it.
Sorry.
So let me just read what they have done. Additionally, we have three fellows who could not be here today. Robert J. Bodnar of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University for work on fluid and multi-inclusion studies, ranging from synthesis of inclusion and the study of their PVT properties to geological application, documenting the role of fluids and melt in the earth and meteorites. Susan Trumbore of the Max Planck Institute and the University of California, Irvine, for discovering the characteristic time scale of terrestrial carbon cycling, pioneering the use of radiocarbon in Earth and environmental science, and contributing new understanding of the impact of landscape processes, land use, and climate on the global carbon cycle. And finally, Fu Yanhu of the Chinese Academy of Science for his work using geochemistry to solve fundamental geological problems, in particular the use of isotopes to characterize the age and petrogenesis of a variety of rocks, but especially granitoids, and to them use the information to understand crystal evolution. Please line up here.
That was wonderful to be with you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, everybody.
Oh, thank you again.
Okay, so I think I take it from here. Thank you, Bernard. Sorry about the... Before I introduce our plenary speaker, I would like to remind you about two important events taking place this afternoon. First, the pop-up talks will begin immediately following the plenary here in the ballroom. Please stay around for these short and exciting talks that are sure to be thought-provoking. Second, the Improving Work Climate, Responding to Sexual Harassment workshop will take place at 2:15 today in room 102. Everyone is invited to attend. The GSEAG and this year's organizing committees have worked hard to make Goldschmidt a safe and welcoming environment for all participants. So the subject of today's plenary is an important and relevant one for both the conference and our larger community. Professor Tuba Özkan-Haller is a professor and associate dean for research and faculty advancement at the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. She also holds a joint appointment at OSU's School of Civil and Construction Engineering. Her research program focuses on the prediction of waves, circulation, and bathymetric change among coastlines. She is a member of the Ocean Studies Board of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and she has served as member or chair of several National Academy committees. More recently, she has also become involved in furthering diversity, inclusion, and social justice in STEM academia through the Oregon State Advanced Program and has co-facilitated several of the signature Immersion Summer Seminars. I'd like to thank her for being here today to discuss how we can improve diversity, inclusion, and social justice in the geosciences. Please join me in welcoming her to Goldschmidt.
Excellent. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to speak to you. First, I want to thank the organizing committee of this conference for thinking about including a plenary talk on this subject. That is generally not, this is kind of an unusual thing, I think, for this community as well as the geosciences community in general. I also want to thank you all for being here today to engage in this conversation. Fire alarm and all, you all could have had a longer lunch, but no, instead you chose to come here and engage in this conversation. And the conversation is really going to be about transforming academia. How can we advance diversity, inclusion, and social justice, not just in our institutions, but as a profession? And before I start, I want to acknowledge a few groups at Oregon State University whose work really laid the groundwork for the work that I'm going to be talking about here. And they are my dear colleagues within the Oregon State Advanced Program, as well as the Search Advocacy Program at OSU, which is an award-winning program, along with the very new Social Justice Education Initiative. Okay, before I start, I want to tell you just a little bit more about the kind of research I do. First, full disclosure, I'm not a geochemist, but I am a geoscientist. I work in the very narrow part of the ocean that you can see when you're standing on the coast and looking out towards the ocean, so the nearshore ocean. This area is, of course, the area where humans most readily interact with the ocean, living along its coasts, extracting resources, be it food or energy. This is also the area where surface gravity waves are really dominant, just about affect anything that happens here. So I'm interested in understanding more about waves and predicting them, and I'm interested in understanding more about the circulation in this region, so that because the waves in circulation together really form and shape the landscape, so I'm interested in the geology of the coasts and how they evolve. My work is primarily geared towards, well, I have a very wide range of topics that I work on, in the sense that some of it is very theoretical and others are quite applied. But in general, all the work that I do is sort of geared towards prediction, geared towards forecasting. And as such, I deal a lot with mathematical models and with computer programs and with software technology. So as you might imagine, there are not that many women who do what I do. So I have a lived experience of that. I'm also very interested in passing along the information that we get, the knowledge that we attain, to groups and stakeholders who could benefit from that. And so the concept of engaged research is something that I'm quite excited about. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to realize that I am not an outsider talking to you about diversity, inclusion, and social justice. I am a geoscientist. I love being a geoscientist. I've been in this field for almost 30 years now, and I love what we do because we work on problems that are so important to our society, and because we're a great community. We work on these problems with great creativity, with passion, with integrity, and with grit. I really, really love our community. But over the course of the time that I spent as part of this community, I also have seen things about our field that could probably use some improvement. And I would like us to be self-critical in that way, and I would like us to bring the same level of passion and grit and creativity and integrity to a critical look into our profession. There will be things today that I will say that you will not like hearing. Quite frankly, I don't like hearing them either. There will also be things that I might say that you don't agree with. And that's okay, right? This is a conversation that we're trying to have. But one thing that I'll say is, over the years that I've been doing this work, I've found that I am a lot more effective at doing this work, also a lot more effective at working with people, if I operate out of a position of compassion, rather than out of a position of defensiveness or judgment or anger. So I invite you over the next 40 minutes or so to operate out of a position of compassion and perhaps bring a healthy amount of curiosity into the picture as well. What is the problem in the geosciences? I think our profession, quite frankly, is one of the least diverse in academia. And we're probably not that diverse. We're not that diverse when it comes to the kinds of people who are engaging in this work. Be it gender, be it race, be it physical ability, be it gender identity, sexual orientation, I can go on and on. I'm not going to show you numbers and figures to prove this to you. I think all you really need to do is look around at this particular conference, for instance, or other conferences and meetings you've been to. But I'm going to go further, and I'm going to argue that we are also not very diverse when it comes to other ways in which we engage in our work. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. And this relates to sort of the plethora of work that we do, ranging from basic research all the way to applied research. And then finally, I'm also going to give you examples in ways in which we may need to diversify the way we measure and recognize impact. And even though most of my work, most of this talk is going to be about the first bullet on this list, I'm going to try to argue that some of the approaches that we're using for this first bullet might very well be applicable in other ways in which we can diversify our profession. So keep an open mind about that. Now, before I really get into the meat of the matter, I want to start with some starting assumptions. The first and most important starting assumption is that I'm assuming that people of differing gender, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, physical ability, you name it, are equally capable of being successful in academia and the geosciences. Okay? So, if that is true, if we ever find that diverse people are less represented or successful in a particular arena, be it plenary speakers, or look at number of oral presentations by diverse folks in a session, publications in renowned journals, teaching evaluations, panel speakers, do we have an all-male panel again? And if you're not familiar with that website, it's quite hilarious. So if that is the case, if you find that these groups are not very diverse, we will not assume that it is because there is just less diverse people available. We will not assume that they are less capable, and we will not assume that they're just not trying hard enough. Once we eliminate those excuses, then we're left with this picture of, okay, so why is this happening over and over again and over a prolonged amount of time? I'm going to try to illustrate that with sort of a cartoon, if you will. And here, what I've done is given you 40 qualified men and 40 qualified women. I've used binary gender here, which isn't ideal, but just stick with me here for this one illustrative example. These are a pool of qualified faculty members that we're trying to hire into academia. And it's actually true in many subdisciplines of STEM now that there's equal representation of women and men as they're coming out of the PhD programs. So what happens then? Well, we know that it's not just one or two things, that it's a plethora of things that happen along the way. One of the ways in which folks get affected are implicit bias and stereotyping, and there's been a lot of literature on this. I think we understand this a lot better. We also know what we can do about it. That's what the OSU Search Advocacy Program is about. Now, the list is going to go on, and I'm not going to have time to talk through each one of them, so I'll just list them. There is evidence that there is lack of access by women into informal mentoring networks, and there's more understanding of how important those really are to facilitating success. There's also some evidence that in some places there's less access to resources, larger service role really adds. And then there's ways in which women are treated within academia, passive-aggressive behavior, microaggressions, horizontal aggressions are a very real thing. Sexual harassment is, of course, something we've been talking more about over the last year or so. And if you haven't seen the National Academy's report on sexual harassment, I really encourage you to look at it. They talk more about the term gender harassment, and they talk about how over the long run, it has very similar effects to maybe one sexual harassment incident. And so if you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to. So also, if you want to start working on some of these issues right away, right, you're looking at this list and it's growing and growing. This particular one you can get started on right away this afternoon because there is a workshop this afternoon in room 102. By the way, this morning's email apparently incorrectly stated the room. It is going to be room 102, where you can learn about how this issue affects people in ways in which you can be a bystander that interrupts this behavior and prevents it from getting bigger. Okay, back to our list. What else? Lack of family-related policies disproportionately affect women. Lack of dual career policies disproportionately affect women. And then I'm going to say the white elephant in the room, P&T processes need to be looked at. Lack of equitable reward structures, and the list goes on and on. Okay, so how can we look at all of these? I'm going to argue that some of these are symptoms and some of these are the underlying problem. But we certainly need a systematic way of addressing all of these. Because all of these together put us in a situation where we essentially end up with about only 20% of women in STEM within faculty ranks, and as the ranks go up, the numbers decrease, as you know. It is a leaky pipeline. I've also made some blue dots disappear. Some of these issues certainly affect men as well, but disproportionately appear to be affecting women. So what do we do in a systematic way? Almost a decade and a half ago now, NSF recognized that there was an institutional problem, that it isn't about individuals behaving certain ways that causes all of this to happen, that there is an institutional framework within which all of this is happening. And so they created the NSF Advanced program, which is really geared towards institutional transformation, not individual change, but institutional change. A few years ago, Oregon State put in a proposal, and when we did, we sort of thought very carefully about broadening what NSF Advanced was about. NSF Advanced really only talks about women in academic science and engineering careers, but we wanted to broaden the vision a little bit. We want to move beyond, first of all, we want to move beyond just diversity. It's not good enough to just increase our numbers, engage more women, and bring them into the disciplines. It's also important that while they're in our discipline, in our field, that they feel like they're being treated justly. They feel like they can actually produce as much science as they can. We want to move beyond monolithic gender. We want to consider this concept of intersectionality. It turns out women come in many different flavors. A white woman's experience in academia, it turns out, is quite different from the experience of a woman of color. It's quite different from the experience of a man of color, quite different from the experience of a man of color who happens to have a physical disability. So this concept of intersectionality really tries to dig a little bit deeper into the experiences of individuals. And then finally, we want to move past binaries. This sort of binary of man and woman can be problematic, especially for gender nonconforming folks, right, who become invisible if we just do things by men and women. The other thing that's different about our program is we focus our intervention towards people in power. So people who are senior faculty members, people who are in administration, who actually have the power to change policies. It isn't that we don't think that folks from underrepresented groups need support and mentoring as they're going through the process, but our goal is really to change the landscape out from under them as they're going through the process. We are not interested in providing folks with a rule book. We're not interested in workshops that give people lists of do's and don'ts. We're interested in trying to attain a deep understanding of the issues so people can make up their own rule books, so that people know what the issues actually are and devise solutions. And we want to empower faculty and administrators to imagine what their transformed institution would be, right? Think about their own units, their own realm, and figure out what their individual problems are and then devise solutions to it. And so was born Oregon State Advanced, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. And the one other thing that I will point out to you is that we function on 3 levels of influence: the personal, the symbolic, and the institutional, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so even though what we're doing is a little bit different from what other advanced institutions have done, it actually is not new as far as OSU's institutional context is concerned. OSU has had, since the mid-1990s, a program that we call Difference, Power, and Discrimination Program, which essentially oversees a baccalaureate core requirement that every undergraduate student at OSU take a class that deals with issues of difference, power, and discrimination, preferably as it occurs within their field of study. And so in order to prepare faculty, in order to help them devise and develop courses that deal with these issues, there is a 2-week immersion program that gets facilitated every summer where faculty participate. And the idea there is about curricular transformation. And the curriculum that the DPD summer program uses is based on something called the theory of systems of oppression, which was devised by Patricia Hill Collins in 1993, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And so what we did is we mirrored our advanced seminar. We call it a seminar, and it isn't just a 1-hour seminar. I'll tell you more about that. To mirror sort of the curriculum of the Difference, Power, and Discrimination program, but not geared towards curricular transformation, instead geared towards institutional transformation. So both of them share this common language of the theory of systems of oppression. And so what that is about is it's essentially a theoretical framework. And I know the word oppression is kind of a heavy word to immediately throw at you. But remember that there is actually an entire literature that deals with these theories. And just like we in our field use words in a very specific way that for the common people might mean very different things, this particular set of literature also uses these words in very particular ways. And so this particular theory then tries to explain why power systems reproduce and maintain themselves, and it does so by considering three inner influential dimensions. And these dimensions are the individual dimension, the symbolic dimension, and the institutional dimension. And I'll tell you more about all three of these. So the advanced seminar is a 60-hour immersion program that takes place over the course of 2 weeks. 60 hours, you read right, not 6. We essentially engage people for 6 hours a day for a total of 9 days over the course of 2 weeks. So you get a 3-day long weekend in between. We engage theories of systems of oppression. We're essentially trying to teach people this new language and to look at the world through this new lens. We pay a lot of attention to intersectionality. Remember, not all of the experiences of women, say, are all the same. We ask the participants to engage in personal reflection. That's important to understand your social positioning and the way in which you're interacting with the world, but we don't spend a lot of time on that because there's a lot of evidence that shows that personal transformation does not lead to institutional transformation. So we really challenge our participants to examine their own culture, to look at their policies and practices and norms and beliefs and identify which ones of those or what aspects of those form barriers. And barriers that essentially favor some and disadvantage others, therefore reproduce hierarchy and dominance. Actually, let me add one more thing here. So up to date, we have facilitated 9 advanced seminars. They contain around 15 participants, so it's a very small group. So if you add them all together, we have about 135 folks at OSU who have gone through this program. The seminar is co-facilitated by 2 individuals, one with a background, with a social science background, who's really well-versed in these particular piece of literature, and the other, a person from the STEM discipline, who can essentially sort of serve as a translator, if you will, or present a lot of examples that pertain to STEM. I have co-facilitated the seminar twice as sort of the STEM person who comes into the picture, and I will admit to you that both times they were probably the most intense 2 weeks of my professional life. This experience is very intense, both for the facilitators, but also for the participants. As you can imagine, there's a lot of difficult conversations that take place, but also a lot of learning and growing and bonding that takes place. And so you're going to ask me, like, what kinds of things do you do during the seminar? And I'll try to give you just a flavor of some of the things that we do. And so one of the things that we do contains to the individual dimension, and you'll see a little bubble up top that tells you which dimension I'm talking about. Social identity categories, we try to see if we can sort of figure out how everybody is socially positioned. And so it could be race, sex, gender, religious affiliation, sexual orientation. All of these things are categories that pertain to how we perceive the world or how we interact with the world. And so this really leads to the idea of this mosaic of identity, of intersectionality. And it's really important to understand this because as it turns out over the years, when we take data and parse it by men and women, because women in STEM disciplines, because white women tend to dominate, the number of white women is much more than the number of women of color within STEM disciplines. When we parse the data by only men and women, we end up really only seeing the story of white women because they dominate over the information that could be trickling in about the stories of women of color. So it isn't until we look at the data in a much more multidimensional way that we can understand why women of color are having a much harder time infiltrating into the geosciences, for instance, compared to white women. So it's very important to look at our world through this intersectional lens. And so one of the things that we do, one of the activities that we do, is to ask folks to write down their social identities for each category. And I want you to just look at these categories really quick and sort of just do this in your mind. You know, you can sort of pick, and maybe the particular group that you belong to isn't listed here, but you certainly will know what they are. And then the second thing I want you to do, just think about this, is to rank these in the order of importance to you. We usually give people a good amount of time to go through this exercise. I don't have that kind of time to give to you today. But if you can just sort of think about it, you know, what is most important to you? And some people have a really hard time doing this kind of ranking, prioritizing. Others, not so much. Now, if you look at all of these social categories, we can kind of see within the geosciences what the dominant culture is, right? Let's start with race. So what's the dominant race within the geosciences in this room? Anybody? White, right? Okay. The dominant sex, male, right? We can sort of put the story together. There is a dominant culture, and when we think of this as a dominant culture box, white, male, straight, married, I could continue. It isn't to say that any of these are good or bad, it's just that it happens to be the dominant culture. And Patricia Hill Collins says that with that dominant culture, because it's a dominant culture, these folks hold social, economic, political power, and considering power is an extremely important piece here. Now, when we ask people to prioritize, when we ask them, you know, what's the most important category for you, as it turns out, folks whose categories, whose social identities live within this box have a really hard time prioritizing because they're sort of not seeing that these attributes really contribute to the way in which they interact with the world. Whereas folks who have even just one category, one attribute that differs from this box, say you're not straight, those folks really put that up in the ranking because it actually determines the way in which they interact with the world. It determines the way society treats them, right? So that's a really interesting way of getting at sort of this invisible privilege that being inside of this dominant culture box bestows upon us. And the idea of the social justice then, in this context, is to make sure that there is a balance in terms of access to that power, in terms of access to wealth, opportunities, privileges. Now, we don't spend a lot of time, really, talking about the individual dimension. We spend a lot more time talking about the symbolic dimension because this is a dimension that in STEM culture often gets neglected. These are really the unintentional messages that we're sending to the world. Whether or not they're intentional or not doesn't actually matter because impact is what matters. What messaging are people receiving? We do a lot of image analysis. This could be one of these images that we might analyze. This is a cover of Vogue magazine in 2008. And the African American community really objected to this particular image. And a lot of folks were like, why, I don't get it. Why is it? Though, you know, they were made kind of mildly uncomfortable by this image. And that's, of course, intentional, right? Why was this image picked? Because it makes people mildly uncomfortable. Because as they're perusing through magazines, they stop at this image, right? So it's a good way to sell a magazine. But it is perpetuating something. And it isn't until I present people with pictures like this that date back to only the 1920s that people start to understand what's going on here, that we're really perpetuating this image of the black male being a beast that is out to get our white women and carry them away, right? So it's this kind of unintentional messaging that to people from the dominant culture might not even stir, but maybe it's just an uncomfortable feeling, but people who from marginalized groups hear it loud and clear. Here's another image from a source that's a little bit closer to home, Science Magazine, 2014. This cover shows transgender sex workers. And it was a cover, it was a special issue about HIV/AIDS. Now, this cover, too, drew a lot of criticism from the transgender community. There's a number of things that are going on here. Faces that are blurred out, which, of course, has been something that's been used in propaganda for a long time to kind of depersonify somebody, make it possible to objectify them. The lighting of the image, what's central in the image, there's just a lot of things that are problematic here. And certainly, you and I can both imagine ways in which we could portray transgender sex workers in a way that is a lot more respectful. So we do a lot of this kind of image analysis, and then we send our folks out, you know, during that 3-day weekend to sort of peruse and see what they find. And interestingly, once they figure out how to look at an image, they come back to us with all kinds of gems of images and messaging around campus that is really problematic. But the most important piece here is the institutional dimension. And in the institutional dimension, we have to recognize that many of our institutions are structured in a way that ensures that the dominant culture maintains its social, economic, political power. And this isn't our individual's fault, right? This isn't I'm doing this. It really is, we're just responsible for it as an entity. And there are many clear examples of this when you look at the history of race relations in the US. And this is really what I would refer to in my field as a positive feedback loop. And an example that's really quite clear in Oregon is the practice of redlining. How many of you have heard of the word redlining? Know what that is? Yeah, so a few of you. So it's a way to make sure that folks from underrepresented groups are not provided services such as loans, for instance, unless they live in a certain area. So it's a way to make sure that the society stays segregated. And you know, if you know Oregon, maybe you're thinking peace, love, and understanding, but Oregon actually has a very distinct racist history. There's a reason why Oregon is as white as it is right now, but I digress. So that's a policy, right? And the other piece of policy is that schools are funded by property taxes, and yet ethnic communities are living in these areas that are not desirable, and if anybody was to move in there, they couldn't get loans. So essentially, it's making sure that ethnic communities are living in areas that are more poor, their property values are lower, therefore their schools are not as high quality, there's an education gap, there's a wealth gap, poor upward mobility, folks are not represented at the levels that they need to be in order to change these policies. It's a positive feedback loop. Redlining is no longer illegal, but schools still funded by property taxes. So the key here is that we need to look at our relevant university policies and practices and norms and beliefs, right? Not everything is written down. And if you think about it, you know, it starts early. Graduate student admission. We still use GREs for graduate student admission, even though the literature is showing pretty clearly now that, just like SATs, GREs are not an indicator of success in graduate school, but it is a number, and it's easy to go by. Postdoc hiring practices, certainly in my institution, are very problematic and are not impervious to implicit bias at all. Faculty hiring policies need to be looked at, practices around access to information, promotion policies, and dare I say, tenure and promotion policies as well. All of these need to be examined. Now, how do we propel people to examine all of these things? We really create these example experiences. We're not teaching. We're facilitating group discussions. We do a lot of embodied learning. We work a lot of case studies. And importantly, we have participants create action plans that they work on every single day. And we encourage them to create action plans that pertain to their circle of influence. Not say, a university president should do X, Y, Z, but no, what are you going to do within your influence? And then we keep up with them. We organize all cohort gatherings where they get to talk about their progress and also maybe commiserate about new barriers that they have encountered. And these gatherings are actually quite popular. So we try to move people actively into identifying their own problems and find their own solutions and really own the process. So how well are we doing? There's certainly a lot of individual folks who talk about how impactful this experience was, including our president, Ed Ray. Our interim provost as well as our provost have also participated in the full 2-week, 60-hour affair, not even missing an hour, I'm very proud to say. But maybe a better way to look at the impact on individuals is to look at what our NSF third-year site visit review said. And they were really very positive about the impact that we were having on individuals. But of course, individual change does not lead to institutional change. Remember, just because I'm more empathetic and relate better now to a person from an underrepresented group doesn't mean their life changes. We need to change the way policies and practices are functioning around them. At the symbolic level, OSU's made some incredible strides, I'm happy to report. We started with a marketing program that really was producing images that were perceived to be offensive by the Native American community, that is, of which there is quite a contingent in Oregon. But they were also producing things that were sort of, producing messaging that said, men seek solutions and women are caring, right? Sort of, just perpetrating propagating the stereotype. So instead, they have turned around and produced a brand new campaign image that very much is about how OSU serves communities. And as a land, sea, and sun grant university, this is certainly the case. So there's been much progress in that. Institutionally, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. One example is from our College of Engineering, and they decided that it's really their hiring practices that needed to be looked at. And they completely overhauled their hiring practices, including taking advantage of search advocate programs more, including requiring diversity statements from candidates, because this sends a message about how we value diversity at our institution. And then the dean interrupting the process at times, maybe reinserting a candidate into the interview pool. And the College of Engineering over the last 3 years has really made some incredible progress. And Dean Ashford likes to show this particular graph that says in 2014 that they were within land-grant institutions at 15th as far as women faculty were concerned, tied with 11 other institutions. And as of last year, they had propelled themselves to 2nd. But of course, hiring women isn't enough, right? We need to make sure that they get treated justly, that they have a just experience at our institution. And the College of Ag Sciences in particular thought that one of their problems was that faculty were not valuing the work towards diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And part of the reason why they were not valuing it is because they were not participating in it. They didn't realize how hard this work really was. So they said, you know what, we're going to require everyone to do work towards this. And it can come in many different flavors. And they were really fueled also by a parallel event of the Faculty Senate at OSU, which of course, under our shared governance model, owns the promotional and tenure criteria. And in 2015, there was new language added that said that all faculty members are responsible for work in this arena, and that work can be part of their teaching, advising, research extension, or part of their scholarly work. It can really take many flavors. It's not a fourth piece. It's just part of your research, teaching, advising, and service that you do. So we have a long list on our webpage of what forms this can take, right? Because faculty in STEM are like, oh, this is going to make my head explode. I don't know how to do this work as part of my scholarly work. But there are actually many avenues in which we can engage in this work. The only important thing then needs to be, and the College of Ag Sciences is doing this, that the work needs to be valued and that the work needs to be evaluated, that people need to be held accountable. And here's where the little catch is, and why I'm talking to you all today the way I'm talking to you is we can't do this evaluation and valuing one institution at a time. And that's because when people go through promotion and tenure, we send out letters to external reviewers who get to comment on the quality of the work that this person is producing. So if they're not valuing this work, then they're going to say this person should have had more papers, right? Why did they spend time working on that? We need to value this work as a profession. So do we really value in our profession work towards diversity, inclusion, and justice? If we do, how come it's not part of our evaluation process? And you might argue it is, but I will argue back that I've been in this profession long enough and have served on P&T committees long enough to know that oftentimes we revert right back to sort of our antiquated, oh, how many papers, how many PhD students? And remember, this is just between us, right? I also argue that there's other ways in which we expect work from people that gets shoved aside when it comes to P&T time. Communicating the importance of science to policymakers, politicians. A year and a half ago, I was at an AGU meeting where there was a panel discussion about this, and more and more people are being encouraged to become better at this and really communicate their science better to the public because, let's face it, geosciences is under attack. I will argue that part of the reason it's under attack is because we haven't been very good at making ourselves relevant to the public. There are other fields who have done a better job at that than us. But why haven't we made a good job? Why haven't we done a good job about that? It's not that we're bad people. It's because we don't value it. Because among all of the lists of things you have to do, that tends to fall off the edge of the table because the things that you really get rewarded for are the things that you spend more time doing. The last thing that came up was OSU was visited by the chief editor of Nature, Sir Philip Campbell, and he was talking about how journals are really holding our feet to the fire now about properly curating our data sets. It's not going to be okay anymore to say, please contact author for the data. And this is, of course, a really important point. It's important because it's a way to move the science forward. But again, is a person going to curate their data? You and I both know how much work that really is, or are they going to write their next paper? Well, P&T looks at papers, right? They're going to write their next paper. So if we really mean business about these issues, then we really need to align our promotion and tenure criteria, the way in which we carry out this most important process. We need to align them with the values that we say we actually have. When people ask me what a faculty member really does, and by the way, this talk has been very faculty member heavy, you will have noticed, and the reason for that is really because the advanced program produced a lot of these results, and NSF Advance is interested in faculty and academia. I always say a faculty member does two things, right? In an R1 research-intensive institution, we create new knowledge and we communicate that new knowledge to others. It could be students, it could be stakeholders, it could be the public, it could be service outreach. But those two elements really need to be there. We need to create new knowledge and then communicate it. And that really is the essence of what promotion and tenure is trying to evaluate. But I think that we need to do that while also doing these other three things, contributing to diversity, and it could come in number 1 or 2, right? It could be in the creation of new knowledge or not. We need to work to increase science literacy, yes, and we also need to value that work and increasing access to data and products to everybody. My personal opinion is that these values, if they are true, that there needs to be an alignment between these values and our antiquated promotion and tenure system. So what does it look like to transform academia? I think so far we have made progress, but we have made progress at snail's pace. So what does it look like to change that progress to something that is much more bridging of gaps and really having a very broad, much more overarching view of the situation, of what the barriers are, what the actual true problems are, and what the symptoms are that we don't need to worry about if we just take care of the actual problem. And hopefully, I'm trying to convince you here that maybe an out-of-the-box thinking is necessary here, that business as usual isn't going to make us change from this to that. And perhaps one of the ways in which we can do out-of-the-box thinking is through a program like Oregon State Advance. Of course, remember, we really created that program within our institutional context. It works for us. Exactly that program might not work for your institution. Again, you have to own your own culture and problem and figure out what that looks like. I apologize. Now, what the advanced program does, though, is it provides a holistic look at institutional barriers and what policies and practices really form those barriers. But I personally believe that we need to have this conversation as a profession. Because you might argue, I might say, well, my College of Ag Sciences has really done a great job in making sure that diversity work is valued. And you might say, well, my institution is doing a fantastic job valuing those that are curating their data sets. In fact, we're considering that a product similar to a publication. Okay, so we're all sort of doing our piecemeal things. But yet again, when you send letters to my folks for evaluation during P&T and vice versa, our values are, again, not aligned as a profession. And I'm arguing that that's what needs to happen. And I think that professional societies, such as the one that organized this meeting or AGU meetings, and I also think that the national academies might have a leadership role to play in leading us in these conversations and figuring out how to get to a spot that works for our profession. Okay, I'm going to close with just two plugs. One, if you're interested in how this advanced seminar works and whether or not this is something that you can apply in your institution, in our last year of our advanced program, as part of our dissemination, we're doing a 2-week program that we call Train the Trainer, where essentially you can come in and we can teach you and tell you more about the way in which we run this program and achieve impact. We encourage collaborative pairings of a person who is in the liberal arts who really has content matter and knowledge and expertise to be paired up with a STEM person who has an understanding of the STEM culture. So if you're interested in that, you can certainly find us on the webpage, advance.oregonstate.edu. And the second plug that I'll make is one of the things that we had proposed to NSF that they were originally very excited about was the creation of an advanced journal. And this past year, we launched the advanced journal. And so if you're doing work in this arena and want your work published in a place that is peer-reviewed, here again is an opportunity for you to engage. And with that, I thank you for being here and participating in this thought process and in this conversation. Transforming academia is certainly not going to be an easy thing. This is a marathon, not a sprint, right? But what I'm trying to convince you of, that business as usual isn't going to do the trick, that we need to think of ways to really just move the needle in a way that we haven't done before. And perhaps the example that I tried to give you may be one of those ways of achieving that. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tuba. Do we have any questions for Tuba? Okay, and please use the microphone.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's more kind of a comment than a question. But for example, in this room, I think that the male white is not the main proportion or the dominant person that was coming to this seminar. And so I was just wondering, that reminds me also someone who told me in my department, come on, we are in 2018 and female in science is not an issue anymore. So I was just curious, when you have this already dominant male in your department or in your institution, how would you, what can we do to start this conversation and to start this program, for example, in my department would be a no-go, for sure. So I was wondering, how can we try to convince them or bring them to this idea that this would be useful for everybody?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. So, you know, in terms of, this of course is a self-selected group, right? You all came to this particular talk because you were interested. You know, not always is it that easy to entrain folks who are not already a self-selected group. At OSU, we use both carrots and sticks. That's really all you have available. As far as the advanced seminar is concerned, individuals get invitations from the provost directly. It is much more difficult to say no to the provost than to say no to little old Tuba, right? The provost and the president themselves have participated, so that shows the commitment. And again, it is much harder to say, oh, I don't have 2 weeks for this program if the president and provost made the time to do it. So leadership from the top is really important. But then carrots are really important too. How are we rewarding people for participating in this, right? So even though it's very difficult work, and we do get a lot of people who are resistant, that's part of the reason why it gets to be such an intense experience. But interestingly, a lot of the folks who come in resistant also end up being the ones who really, on the other end, carry out a lot of interesting and impactful actions. So the challenge is getting them in the door. Again, it's like a marathon, right? The challenge is showing up at the starting line. Once you get them to show up at the starting line, amazing things can happen.
Thank you for your very positive talk. Just one, also it's one comment, it's not really a question,
Yeah.
but I am French, my colleagues are French too. What was probably missing in your talk is a broader view on the daycare of the babies. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a clear and efficient system proposing daycare even for babies who are 3 months old, which is the case in France, then there is no way to access to high level, because very often the women, they have the duty of taking care of the baby, and there is no choice, actually.
Yes, absolutely.
In a publish or perish world, if you don't have some social help from your state, because it's a state issue, it's a political issue.
Absolutely. And so on that long list of things that I stated, family-friendly policies was one of them, and that's a key family-friendly policy. Certainly in my institution, childcare is a huge problem. You have to sign up for infant care, 9 months before you even conceive the child in order to get a spot when they're actually born. And so those could be one of those institutional policies that a particular person could pick up, right, after they've realized that that is a major barrier for them. Yeah.
Please use the microphone. Go ahead, up to the microphones.
Hi, that was a great talk and sounds like a very interesting program. I think what you showed is indeed very advanced in terms of the landscape that we are acting in. I never heard of an institution that actually took it so far as your institution. But what I want to ask is something about those carrots that you were mentioning. I feel like a lot of people who deeply care about these issues are not being rewarded, including the people who really try to invigorate the discussion about this. And so I was wondering if you have anything to say about that, because I feel like there aren't any carrots, basically. Most of the people who run these programs or try to act upon these things are doing it completely on their own time, completely volunteering to do it. And as a person who has been dealing with these things, the things that I hear a lot from people is like, this is not a part of my job. This is not a part, like, why am I wasting my time on this instead of writing papers?
Yes,
So if you could relate to that.
Yes, and this is why it's so important that as a profession, we put our money where our mouth is. That if we're really interested in diversity and inclusion, if we're really interested in this, it cannot be something that people do on their own time. It cannot be something that select people do, who we pat on the back, maybe give an award to, but then when it comes to promotion and tenure time, we brush all that stuff aside. That is business as usual that can no longer continue. So I'm arguing that societies need to really lead us in the conversation around what promotion and tenure really looks like. That is the ultimate way in which we reward behavior. The reason why we're not making progress is because we're not rewarding it. If we're not rewarding it, it's not going to happen. Thank you.
Question in the back.
Oh, hi. So I really liked the early slide you showed with the dots representing people who might be taking themselves out of a faculty selection pool because of, intrinsic bias or institutional bias. And one question I had was that so many of the programs you mentioned are meant to, I feel like they're geared at people in power on how to make sure that they are fairly hiring people or fairly promoting people. And I'm wondering how you would advise someone or people who maybe have been affected by bias or discrimination, who have a very sour opinion of the academic workforce, or who feel like their CV is not as strong as it could be because they've dealt with discrimination. How do you keep them trying or keep them in the workforce, or make sure that they're still a strong candidate? Because academia, as someone else said, it can be so ruthless, a make no excuses kind of attitude. What would you tell them?
Yes, that's a very good question, and one that I don't have a good answer to, unfortunately, I will admit. These issues around this work towards diversity, inclusion, social justice has been, and I'll tell you a personal anecdote, has been in me from the get-go. But at one point when I was an assistant professor, I realized that the time I was putting into it was essentially going to make me unsuccessful as an academic. And so what I had to do personally, and this is not something I'm proud of, but I will share with you, is to put that work on the back burner, to essentially just concentrate on my more traditional science, which I also enjoy, until I got to the point where I had proved myself enough as a scientist in order to engage with this work. And still, when we got our NSF Advanced project funded, one piece of advice that I got from a program manager at NSF was, oh boy, Tuba, this advanced stuff, it's a career killer for the STEM people who are involved. Yeah, this is a reality. And the advice I got was that I should make sure that within my science community that I remain a respected scientist. So I'm going crazy, publishing papers, making sure I give the science talks, right? Because as long as I maintain the well-respected science persona, I get listened to. But if I lose it, then I no longer do, right? Then I'm just a failed scientist who just went into this other thing. So again, this comes back to the idea of people don't realize how hard this work is, and people don't realize how they get affected. I hear this over and over again, oh, is that really it? They should just get a thicker skin. But it is not, especially, in that picture of science of the transgender folks. Really? I should just get a thicker skin. But it is not for us to say how folks feel about a certain image or how much emotional time gets invested into processing that, and energy that could have been used to further the science, and we all would have been better if it was just for those of us in the dominant culture to kind of step back and think about what kind of implicit imaging we're sending, what kind of implicit messaging we're sending. Remember, the fact that it was unintentional is not important. Impact is what's important. So I know I didn't really answer your question very well. It is certainly one of those questions at the heart of what we're talking about here. But it is also why I think we need to have these conversations as a community, not just as institutions. Thank you.
Please.
So one of the ongoing conversations that we have in our department is the role of field camp in geoscience education at the undergraduate level, recognizing that it's both a really very important part of the major, but also can represent a significant barrier to many people from underrepresented populations who have maybe, childcare or family obligations that they can't go be in the field for 6 weeks.
Or physical disabilities that prevent them.
Right. And I was just wondering if you have had any conversations about this issue or strategies to try to address that.
Right. Again, I don't come with all of the answers, but I come with ways, a lens of thinking that could help us solve some of these problems. One of the other things that happens at field camp is really how do we keep people safe? How do we keep them from being sexually harassed or gender harassment issues? And there too, this afternoon's workshop could very well give you some of the tools in which you can make sure that you can nip these problems in the bud before they grow to be bigger. But yes, field camp is an amazing experience, but also an amazing burden, right? So how do we balance, how do we communicate this information to these diverse audiences in ways that are, where everyone can get out of it what the learning outcome really is? It really is about stepping back and devising ways of engaging with the students that are not just the standard that we've grown up in. Remember, we're a self-selected crowd. We do well being lectured at. We are physically able, we do well when we go into the field. But this is why, for instance, we use theater of the oppressed. It's an embodied learning experience, and at first we get a lot of resistance to that. No, just tell me what I would have learned had I done it. It's not the same thing, right? So we need to really expand beyond the ways in which we learned, or we learn well, to engage with our students from diverse backgrounds.
We're going to take 2 more questions and then move on to the pop-up talks.
Okay, so I have a question about cultures, not gender related at all, but how does your program deal with having someone come in from a completely different culture, so graduate student, different culture, but they have to operate within a pretty unique culture of academia, our Western culture, I would say.
Yes. Yes, so I have a personal lived experience with this, right? I come from a Middle Eastern culture, and when I came to this country, I had to relearn logic. I had to learn to think in Western ways, right? And that can be, and what I brought with me, I'm sure I brought things from my culture that are positive, but I also brought things from my culture that were negative. It is very important that I think we build a culture that is inclusive of those external pieces that could actually be good influences, while also maintaining our own moral compass, balance, things that we feel strongly about. And that maybe is another reason why it's very important as a profession to explicitly have the conversation about what our values are. Let's write them down. What are our values as a profession? Right? It isn't until we write them down that we can communicate them, that we can actually make sure that our reward system aligns with them. I think every one of us in our heads has an idea as to what those values are, but we really haven't had those conversations. Within my unit and my institution, we have had conversations about our values, and I think they're very helpful in making sure that folks who come in from outside cultures sort of understand what kind of a culture, that they're coming into.
So I just have to, are we going to try to teach them how to behave in our culture, even if theirs has in some ways better? I know I'm stepping into difficult grounds here, but
yes.
Drop that because you're not going to succeed, even though it's kind of better.
Right. Well, I would say again, I know what you're saying. Are we going to sort of assimilate them into behaving certain ways? And certainly I think we do that actively today, right? And I will tell you that, for instance, I love dressing in color. It was maybe 12 years in the profession before I put on a red shirt, and somebody said, oh, something special going on today? You're wearing red, right? We don't bring our entire self to work because we're trying to sort of fit in, right? And so how much of that is good, how much of that is bad? Those are all questions that we need to grapple with.
Okay, last question, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So I'm a faculty at Cornell University. I'm one of 2 Black women in the entire engineering college. And I'm wondering from your perspective if you've addressed or if you've had people come to you, people of color, and for them to be seen first as color and not because they are specifically from specific gender or race. And I want to give a little kind of short example. For example, I wanted to have some institutional support, and my chair said to me at some point, he said, well, we hired you to be here, as in it was a privilege for you to be here as a faculty, even though I have the pedigree and I'm well trained to be in this position. And it was kind of like we give you this reward. And it's when there was finally some recruitment interest that they started to see me differently. And one of my colleagues said to me, well, they should keep you because you're a Black woman. And I said, no, they should keep me because I'm good at my work. So I'm wondering, if you've addressed that in your program.
Yes.
And yeah.
So first, I'm really sorry about your experience, but thank you for sharing it. And I would suspect that many people in this room might have stories like that to share, be it because they were told that they were hired, oh, you're only hired because you're a woman, and experiences like that. And yes, we talk about exactly those kinds of issues at length. This is sort of what this concept of intersectionality is about. And it also is about the symbolic dimension, right? About sort of how we communicate when we say something. What does that really mean when we're communicating? And how are those words perceived from the other side? That sort of developing of empathy and being able to see what life is like for people who are outside of that dominant box. Right? Because people who are inside the dominant box, everything seems so normalized for them. And so yes, these are some of the difficult conversations that we do have. One thing that we try to make sure is we usually have people of color within the seminar and as part of the participants. One thing that we try to make sure of is that we don't use them as, oh, and so Jessica, can you tell us how people of color feel about this? We don't do that. We don't tokenize people, and we don't ask them to speak for their entire group. Because again, intersectionality tells us that everyone has a different experience that is a combination of all of these different categories that shape the way in which they view the world and interact with it. But yes, these are some of the difficult conversations, and I will tell you that at times, folks come out saying, oh my God, I can't believe I said that 3 years ago to so-and-so. All of a sudden they're starting to realize, or that's the first step. And sometimes what happens is they still say those things and then they catch themselves, I'm sorry. And then the next step is to catch themselves before they say it. And the next step is to not even think it, right? And this is a long process, certainly doesn't happen over 2 weeks, but we try to at least initiate it. And our participants tell us that they do a lot of learning afterwards in the next years to come about ways in which they interact with folks from underrepresented groups.
Well, thank you all for being here, and let's give Dr. Özkan-Haller another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Yes, my pleasure.
We can unwire you.